Hi everyone. Today I'm starting a project with my friend and fellow YouTuber Christian Watson. Christian is a constitutional conservative who has previously appeared on Fox News and Newsmax. And no, he is not the Green Bay Packers rookie wide receiver. The link to his channel is in the description box below. I suggest you check out his work. Christian and I don't agree on everything, but we're both alarmed by the new trend of so-called national conservatism. As we'll see over the course of this project, it's really not that new. It just happens to be more fashionable on the right at this point in time. We'll be talking about the core tenets of this philosophy in the coming months on our channels as a joint project. Specifically, we'll be examining the ideas espoused by the American conservative. This publication issued a statement of principles that lays out the core tenets of national conservatism. The statement has dozens of signatories, many of whom you would probably recognize. The link to the statement is in the description box below, should you want to read it for yourself. This publication will be our baseline, but make no mistake, our criticisms will be generally applicable to what we see as a pernicious conservative collectivism that inspires works like this. Today, we'll be discussing our general problems with it. In future videos, we'll be taking on its constituent ideas. First, we'll hear from Christian, then I'll give you my thoughts.
National conservatism poses a major threat to the American experiment, but in order to understand the extent of the threat of national conservatism, it is best to understand the context that gave birth to it. So, classical liberalism is essentially a ideology that came out of the Enlightenment and which has informed many political systems around the world, especially the political system of the United States. The idea that there is a consent of the governed, that the individual has more responsibility and certain moral rights, and those rights act as an imposition upon the government and restrain it and tie its hands from doing certain things, and also act as an imposition upon society, which also leads to the sort of laissez-faire idea of classical liberalism, that the government should not intervene in society or economics, things of that sort. These ideas have been foundational to the United States since its existence. And these ideas are also have been quite ubiquitous throughout the world in various different industries. These ideas have governed economic relationships for a very long while with what has been called the liberal international order, and the Golden Arches theory, which said that if there is a McDonald's in a certain area, which represents trade between two countries, war is less likely. This ideology has been very prevalent in other sort of economic relationships, such as the Reagan Revolution of the 80s and the Thatcher Revolution of the 80s as well, where deregulation and tax cuts were emphasized and the laissez-faire mentality drove the policies of those administrations. And so classical liberalism has been everywhere in politics for quite a long while. But there is a group of people on the political right that say that classical liberalism, far from being a vector for virtuous and benevolent outcomes, actually has allowed the culture to decay to a certain level where society is in danger. Indeed, the influential author Patrick Deneen wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed, which Barack Obama praised as being a good assessment of liberalism, in which he argued that this idea of individualism and free markets and individual liberty that has been at the heart of classical liberalism actually endangered society. It failed, and it has rendered society open to certain ills. Now, Deneen is a part of a larger tradition on the right that call themselves the post-liberals. They are people that want to move beyond classical liberalism and towards a pre-Enlightenment sort of political disposition, where the community and the common good and the nation all stand as higher subjects of our affection as citizens than the individual or freedom per se does. National conservatism is a brand name for post-liberalism. Some of the post-liberals will point to certain particular things as evidence of cultural degradation, such as the rise of what they would call gender ideology. Or they would point to the decay of truth that has occurred with the rise of postmodernism and ideologies like critical race theory and things of that sort. And they will say that classical liberalism, given its laissez-faire mentality, is actually responsible for these ideologies getting out of hand. And there are many critics of classical liberalism, many of whom are not on the right, some of whom are on the left, or some of whom are neutral, who will pose certain paradoxes about the system. They'll say, how can a political system which prioritizes tolerance be tolerant of the intolerant? This is what Karl Popper called the paradox of intolerance. So, with all of these challenges coming to classical liberalism and the post-liberals capitalizing on this criticism, national conservatives in the American context say America needs to move beyond classical liberalism, but it needs to do so with an emphasis on nationalism, on the nation. And so a group of writers and podcasters and thinkers penned the National Conservative Statement, which is influenced and funded by Peter Thiel, and they posted on the American Conservative website. People like Michael Knowles and Charlie Kirk sign on to it. And in that statement, the National Conservatives lay out several different platform planks. I won't get to all of them in this video, but I'll summarize them and I'll summarize my problems with them. Those different platform planks emphasize things such as the importance of honor, virtue, and beauty to a flourishing society. It also emphasizes the importance of national sovereignty to the existence of a nation. It emphasizes the importance of a public life or a common good as well to a good government and a good society as well. And it lays out the plans that these national conservatives have to ensure that all of these concepts are furthered in politics. Well, the problem with all of this is very simple. The national conservatives, while they may have a point about the various cultural ills that plague the West, seek to address those cultural ills in a manner that is very much like them. In essence, national conservatives become what they hate by trying to use tools oftentimes used by people who are anti-culture, anti-liberal, illiberal, and anti-liberty. So, for example, in the National Conservative Manifesto, there is an emphasis on robust state action to correct what national conservatives call moral decay. Well, you have to ask yourself, what is moral decay? And when the government becomes an arbiter of moral activity or morals, beyond simply enforcing the restraint principle of classical liberalism, that all governments are bound to refrain from infringing upon the individual and their rights, when the government goes beyond that, it itself becomes an arbiter of what is moral. Well, the national conservatives emphasize the idea of the public good. And the idea of the public good, just like the idea of the common good, says that there is a collective that decides and sets the standard for what is right and what is moral. Well, when you have a collective deciding things, history will tell you that this approach is quite disastrous. Collectives have a bad track record, whether it be in Stalin's Russia, whether it be in Nazi Germany, whether it be in Mao's revolution or what have you. But also, from a moral standpoint, the moment you divorce morality from the measurable individual and you take it to an immeasurable abstract idea like the common good, which cannot be calculated, which cannot be measured in any meaningful way, is the moment you leave yourself open to political and moral abuse. National conservatism, by putting emphasis on the common good, leaves itself open to abuse because their ideas and standards are abstract and open to interpretation. And whoever holds the power can therefore interpret that idea in their own advantage. And I also think this is another problem with national conservatism. They don't understand how power works. Power does not necessarily work on the basis of principle. I certainly wish it did. Power is a tool used and directed by the intent of those who willed it. And no matter, even if someone proclaims to have national conservative principles, there is nothing stopping that person from using their tools, power, to justify, under the banner of national conservatism, things that might even deviate and go against that. Once again, power is a different beast in and of itself. But also, another thing about national conservatism which is concerning is that it is strategic and it is strategically deceptive. So, for example, national conservatives will emphasize certain things like national sovereignty, which many people, including many classical liberals or libertarians, can somewhat get on board with, depending on how it's framed. If you were to say, well, there are certain global bodies, global governments, like the United Nations or the WEF, that could do things that would harm the preservation of a nation, you could have plenty of classical liberal people saying, well, perhaps this is a concern. But the problem is, national conservatives take general concerns and tie those into politics, and in doing so, deceive a lot of people who may share those general concerns into joining their coalition, while hiding the other unsavory parts of their ideology. Like I mentioned, the idea of the common good, the public good over the individual, the idea of rejecting classical liberalism because society has gone its own direction. The idea of doing all these things, which completely miss the point of the classical liberal project. And I'll close on this. The classical liberal project is not about dictating the kind of society you or I can live in. The classical liberal project is about recognizing the moral and proper restraints of government as deduced from natural law and first principles that are necessary for a flourishing society, and then setting people like you and me up in a social context to be able to improve, perfect, and enrich the culture with our creative genius. Classical liberalism is the only ideology that makes way for man to have any impact in society, because it does not presume that his role in society is dictated at the behest of a tyrant or a king or a lord or whatever. He is not a serf. This is not a serfdom. He is not a subject. He is a fully individual and free man. When national conservatives reject that, they reject the basis, the entire basis for the United States. And in essence, they want a different country than was conceived by our founders and what is currently in the United States. They want a foundationally different country. And if we value freedom, we cannot allow that to happen. So as this series continues, I look forward to being able to express more of my thoughts on the particular points that national conservatives make. But as for now, this is a general overview.
If you look at the statement of principles issued by the American conservative, at first glance, much of it will appear to be completely unobjectionable, if not desirable, to most right-leaning people. As someone who lands somewhere on the political spectrum between libertarian and neoliberal, much of it even resonates with me, and much of it that doesn't is within the realm of my normal disagreements with conservatives. Where I think they make the more serious, fundamental errors is in how they view power and the nature of the state. Any statement of principles is necessarily going to be sparse on details. But if we look closely at the rhetoric in the statement of principles, it betrays itself at multiple points. Let's take a look at their sixth plank on free enterprise. The statement reads, "We believe that an economy based on private property and free enterprise is best suited to promoting the prosperity of the nation and accords with the tradition of individual liberty that are central to the Anglo-American political tradition." I could nitpick, but by and large I agree with that. We reject the socialist principle, which supposes that the economic activity of the nation can be conducted in accordance with a rational plan dictated by the state. I completely agree with that. It's music to my ears. But the free market cannot be absolute. And here we go. Economic policy must serve the general welfare of the nation. Today, globalized markets allow hostile foreign powers to despoil America and other countries of their manufacturing capacity, weakening them economically and dividing them internally. At the same time, transnational corporations showing little loyalty to any nation damage public life by censoring political speech, flooding the country with dangerous and addictive substances and pornography, and promoting obsessive, destructive personal habits. A prudent national economic policy should promote free enterprise, but it must also mitigate threats to the national interest, aggressively pursue economic independence from hostile powers, nurture industries crucial for national defense, and restore and upgrade manufacturing capabilities to the public welfare. Crony capitalism, the selective promotion of corporate profit-making by organs of state power, should be energetically exposed and opposed. This plank of the statement is an excellent example of trying to have things both ways. They begin by talking about individual liberty and private property. On top of that, they reject collectivism when they talk about turning away from the socialist principle that supposes that economic activity of a nation can be conducted according to a rational plan. That's all well and good, Except they then go on to invoke collectivism. They talk about how the economy must serve the general welfare of the nation, rail against corporations that show little loyalty to the nation, and call for government intervention in the economy for the sake of mitigating threats to the national interest. Even though these ends are vague, you might think that they sound like desirable goals to pursue. In fact, you might find them so desirable or necessary that you believe curtailing individual liberty and economic choices is something that must be done in their pursuit. We can debate that, and we'll certainly adjudicate that matter in future installments of this series. But for now, I'll just leave it here. Where the National Conservatives fundamentally err is not in their ends, but their means. Practically speaking, achieving these goals necessarily means putting some human beings in charge of others through the power of the state. The National Conservatives correctly lament socialists and their attempts to rationally plan the economy, but they seem not to have learned one of the most important lessons of the 20th century socialist experiments. It isn't just that people are fundamentally incapable of planning an economy, which is certainly the case, as there's simply too much information to account for. It's that they cannot be trusted to do so. The Achilles heel of socialism is that it fails to account for human nature. Put people in charge of the economy and they will use it primarily to serve their own interests, not the collective. Even though most socialists claim to be serving the collective, and some of them genuinely thought they were doing that, it enabled the worst human behavior because man's selfishness did not go away. And those in power almost always abuse their positions. National conservatism fundamentally accepts the premise that some people should be put in charge of others to steer the collective in a certain direction. They seek to do this not just with the economy, but with much of civil society as well. The direction they seek to steer these things is not the same as the socialists, and the hand they hope to use is not nearly as heavy. But you're still giving other human beings far more power than they should be trusted with. So many of the tenets of this platform, when applied, will encroach on people's liberty. Perhaps you don't think that liberty is something that ought to be valued in its own right. So let me make a more practical case to you. Who do you trust to make decisions on your behalf? Much less on the behalf of complete strangers. I don't trust anyone to do that. Yes, with individual liberty, some people will make terrible choices. That's unfortunate, though it's preferable to the alternative, which is what National Conservatism is offering. Most people on the right recognize the need to reject left-wing social engineering. I'm here to argue that we should reject right-wing social engineering as well.